The Montana dawn broke over Carter's ranch with a quiet insistence, painting the rolling plains in hues of gold and amber. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of dew-soaked grass and the faint musk of cattle grazing in the distance. James Carter, a man carved from the rugged earth itself, rode his horse Shadow along the fence line, his eyes scanning the horizon with a practiced squint. At 35, James was tall, broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from years of roping and mending fences. His face, weathered by sun and wind, held a hardness that hadn't always been there. Once, he'd been a man of easy smiles, the kind who'd tip his hat to passers-by in Willow Creek and share a beer with neighbors under the stars. But that was before Emily, his wife, had been stolen by leukemia 3 years ago, leaving him a hollow shell on a ranch that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Shadow snorted, his hooves kicking up small clouds of dust as they navigated the narrow path through the wheat fields. The ranch sprawled across 500 acres, a patchwork of golden crops, grazing pastures, and a sturdy barn that stood like a sentinel against the distant mountains. James tightened his grip on the reins, his thoughts as heavy as the morning mist. He didn't talk much these days, not to the townsfolk who whispered about his reclusiveness, not to the delivery drivers who dropped off supplies, and certainly not to Martha, the housekeeper who came daily to keep the house from falling into disrepair. Solitude was his companion now, along with Daisy, his golden retriever, who trailed him faithfully through the fields. "Daisy, you keepin' up?" James called, glancing over his shoulder. The dog, her coat gleaming in the early light, trotted, a few paces behind, her tongue lolling out. She was pregnant, her belly low and heavy, and James had been keeping a close eye on her. The vet had said she was due any day now, and James had already prepared a corner of the barn with clean straw and blankets. Daisy was more than a pet. She was his anchor, the one living thing that didn't ask questions or expect him to be anything other than what he was. The ranch house loomed in the distance, a 2-story structure of weathered wood and stone, its wraparound porch sagging slightly under the weight of time. It had been Emily's dream, this place, a home where they'd raise children, grow old, and watch the seasons change. They'd bought it 10 years ago, full of plans, but fate had other ideas. The first signs of Emily's illness had come during a spring much like this one, a nagging pain she'd dismissed as nothing. By summer, the diagnosis had landed like a sledgehammer: leukemia, aggressive and unforgiving. James had fought it with her, pouring every dollar he had into treatments, driving her to specialists in Bozeman and Denver, holding her hand through endless nights in sterile hospital rooms. But nothing had been enough. When she died, a part of him died too, buried alongside her in the Willow Creek Cemetery. James dismounted near the corral, giving Shadow a pat on the neck before tying him to a post. He checked the cattle, their breath steaming in the cool air, and ran a hand along the fence, testing for weak spots. Routine was his salvation, a way to keep the memories at bay. He glanced toward the barn where Daisy had wandered, her nose low to the ground. "Don't go too far, girl," he muttered, but she was already out of sight, likely sniffing out a quiet spot to rest. Inside the house, Martha was already at work, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. She was a stout woman in her 60s, with graying hair pulled into a tight bun and a no-nonsense demeanor that suited James just fine. She didn't pry, didn't chatter, just did her job and left him to his silence. "Morning, Mr. Carter," she said as he stepped into the kitchen, her voice warm but reserved. She was setting out a plate of eggs and toast, the same breakfast she'd made every day for the past 3 years. "Morning, Martha," James replied, nodding as he poured himself a cup of coffee. He glanced around the kitchen, expecting to see Daisy curled up in her usual spot by the hearth, but her bed was empty. His brow furrowed. "You seen Daisy this morning?" Martha shook her head, wiping her hands on her apron. "Not yet. Thought she was with you." James took a sip of coffee, the hot liquid grounding him. "Probably out in the yard. She's been restless with those pups coming." He didn't think much of it. Daisy often wandered off to explore, but a faint unease settled in his chest. She was usually by his side when he woke, her tail thumping against the floor, waiting for a scrap of toast. He finished his breakfast quickly, the silence between him and Martha comfortable, but heavy. As he stepped outside, the sun was climbing, higher, casting long shadows across the yard. "Daisy!" he called, his voice carrying over the fields. No response. He checked the orchard, her favorite spot to nap, but found only the rustle of leaves in the breeze. He called again, louder this time, and still nothing. The unease grew sharper, like a thorn under his skin. "She's probably in the barn," he muttered to himself, heading toward the sturdy wooden structure. Daisy had been sniffing around there lately, likely drawn to the quiet and the soft straw. As he approached, he noticed something odd. Dark spots on the dirt path leading to the barn door. He knelt, touching one with his fingertip. Blood. Fresh and wet. His heart kicked up a notch. "Daisy," he whispered, his voice tight. The barn door was slightly ajar, creaking as he pushed it open. The air inside was cool and dim, smelling of hay and old wood. "Daisy, you in here?" he called, his eyes adjusting to the low light. A soft whimper came from the far corner, where he'd set up her birthing spot. Relief flooded him. She was alive. He strode forward, his boots thudding against the packed earth floor. But as he reached the pile of straw, he froze. Daisy lay there, her golden fur matted with sweat, her breathing labored but steady. Around her were 4 tiny puppies, squirming and mewling, their eyes still closed. But nestled among them impossibly was something else. A human baby. Its skin was pink and delicate, its tiny arms and legs moving faintly as it lay against Daisy's side, nursing alongside the pups. James blinked, his mind refusing to process what he saw. A baby. A human baby. In his barn. With his dog. "What the hell?" he murmured, his voice barely audible. He took a step closer, crouching to get a better look. The baby was small, no bigger than the puppies, its chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Daisy looked up at him, her brown eyes soft and trusting, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. She licked the baby gently, then returned to her puppies, her maternal instinct unwavering. James's heart pounded, his thoughts a chaotic jumble. This wasn't possible. Dogs didn't give birth to humans. His first instinct was to check Daisy, to see if she was hurt. But she seemed fine, just exhausted from labor. The blood on the path must have been from the birth, but whose birth? He ran a hand through his hair, his calloused fingers trembling. Was this some kind of trick? A hallucination? He'd heard of grief doing strange things to a man's mind, but this was beyond comprehension. He stood, his legs unsteady, and scanned the barn for answers. The hay bales, the rusted tools, the stacks of feed sacks. All familiar. All normal. But then he heard it, a faint rustle like fabric brushing against straw. His hand went to the shotgun leaning against the wall, an old habit from years of living alone in the wilds. "Who's there?" he called, his voice sharp, cutting through the silence. No answer, but the rustle came again, from the darkest corner of the barn. James lifted the shotgun, his grip steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Show yourself now," he demanded, stepping toward the sound. The air felt heavier, charged with something he couldn't name. A figure emerged slowly from behind a pile of hay. A woman, young and frail, her auburn hair tangled and her clothes stained with dirt and blood. Her hands were raised, trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't shoot. I didn't mean to trespass." James lowered the shotgun slightly, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. She looked like she hadn't eaten in days, her face pale and her frame thin, save for the slight roundness that suggested she'd recently been pregnant. The pieces clicked together and his gaze darted back to the baby. "That yours?" he asked, nodding toward the infant still nestled against Daisy. The woman nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, his name's Noah. I didn't know what else to do." Her voice broke and she sank to her knees, her hands covering her face. "I'm sorry. I was so scared." James's mind raced. A runaway mother, a newborn in his barn, Daisy caring for the child as if it were her own. It was too much to process. He set the shotgun down, leaning it against a post, and took a cautious step toward her, "Who are you?" he asked, his tone softer but still guarded. "And why the hell are you hiding in my barn?" Her name was Sarah, she said, her words tumbling out between sobs. She was 24, from a small town 100 miles away, and she'd been running from her ex, Tom, a man who'd made her life a living hell. Pregnant and desperate, she'd fled to the middle of nowhere, hoping to disappear. She'd given birth in the barn the night before, alone and terrified, and when she saw Daisy nursing her puppies, she'd made a desperate choice. I thought she'd keep him safe," Sarah said, her eyes pleading for understanding. "I didn't know if I'd make it. I just wanted him to have a chance." James stared at her, his chest tight with a mix of anger and pity. He wanted to tell her to leave, to take her problems elsewhere. But the sight of the baby, Noah, stirred something deep inside him. Emily's voice echoed in his mind, her gentle insistence that kindness was never wasted. He sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "You can't stay in the barn," he said finally. "It's cold, dirty, and no place for a baby. Come with me to the house." Sarah's eyes widened, as if she couldn't believe he wasn't throwing her out. You're not going to turn me in?" "Not today," James said gruffly, picking up his coat from a nearby hook. He approached Daisy, who watched him with calm trust, and gently wrapped Noah in the coat, cradling the tiny body with a care he hadn't known he possessed. The baby stirred, letting out a soft coo, and James felt a pang in his chest, a warmth he hadn't felt since Emily. He shook it off, turning to Sarah. "What's your name again?" "Sarah," she whispered, struggling to her feet. "All right, Sarah, let's go." He led the way out of the barn, Sarah trailing behind, her steps hesitant as if she feared he'd change his mind. Daisy stayed with her puppies, her eyes following James as he carried the human child she'd briefly claimed as her own. The walk to the house was silent, the only sounds the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant call of a meadowlark. When they stepped inside, Martha was in the kitchen, her hands frozen mid-motion as she saw James with a baby in his arms and a disheveled young woman at his side. "Lord above, James, what's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp with shock. "I'll explain later," James said, his tone leaving no room for questions. "Get some hot water, clean towels, and see if you can find any of Emily's old clothes that might fit her." He nodded toward Sarah, who stood frozen in the doorway, clutching her arms as if to shield herself from the world. Martha's eyes darted between them, but she nodded, moving quickly to gather supplies. James gestured to the living room sofa. "Sit down, Sarah. You look like you're about to fall over." Sarah obeyed, her movements slow and uncertain. James laid Noah on a blanket beside her, the baby's tiny face peaceful despite the chaos of the morning. He stepped back, watching as Sarah reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched her son's cheek. "He's okay," she whispered, more to herself than to James. "He's really okay." James didn't respond, his mind still reeling. He wasn't sure what he was doing, taking in a stranger and her child, but something about Noah's fragile presence felt like a tether to a part of himself he'd buried. Martha returned with a stack of towels and a bundle of clothes, simple dresses and sweaters that had once belonged to Emily. The sight of them twisted something in James's chest, but he pushed it down. "Martha, help her get cleaned up," he said, his voice gruff. "I'll take care of the baby." Sarah looked up, startled. You're sure?" "I'm sure," James said, picking up Noah again. The baby was light, almost weightless, and James's large hands moved with a gentleness that surprised even him. Martha led Sarah to the bathroom, her maternal instincts kicking in as she guided the young woman with a firm but kind hand. Alone in the living room, James stared down at Noah, who blinked up at him with unfocused eyes. "All right, little guy," he murmured, settling into a chair. "Let's get you cleaned up too." He'd never handled a newborn before, but he remembered Emily talking about her dreams of motherhood, the way she'd light up describing how she'd bathe their future children, singing softly to keep them calm. The memory stung, but it guided him as he filled a basin with warm water and carefully washed Noah's delicate skin, using a soft cloth to wipe away the grime of the barn. The baby squirmed, but didn't cry, his tiny noises oddly comforting. In the bathroom, Martha helped Sarah into a tub of warm water, her hands gentle but efficient. "You're safe here, child," she said, wetting Sarah's tangled hair. "James may seem rough, but he's got a good heart. You're lucky you ended up here." Sarah nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The warm water eased the ache in her body, but the fear lingered, a shadow she couldn't shake. When they returned to the living room, Sarah was dressed in one of Emily's old sweaters, her hair damp but combed, her face still pale but less haunted. She stopped short at the sight of James cradling Noah, the baby wrapped in a clean blanket, sleeping peacefully. "He's fine," James said, his voice softer than before. "Strong little guy from what I can tell." Sarah's lips trembled, and she crossed the room, reaching for Noah. James handed him over carefully, their hands brushing for a moment. Sarah held her son close, her eyes shining with a mix of relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. I don't know how to repay you." "Don't worry about that," James said, standing and turning away to hide the emotion in his eyes. "Just rest. We'll figure out what's next." Martha watched from the kitchen doorway, her expression unreadable. She'd seen James at his lowest, a man consumed by grief, and now here he was, opening his home to a stranger and her child. Something was shifting, and she knew it was only the beginning. The sun climbed higher, bathing the ranch in light, but the morning's events cast a long shadow. James stepped outside to check on Daisy, who was still in the barn with her puppies. He knelt beside her, stroking her fur as she licked her pups, her eyes tired but content. "You're something else, girl," he murmured, marveling at how she'd accepted Noah as one of her own. The image of the baby among the puppies was burned into his mind, a surreal tableau that defied everything he knew. Back in the house, Sarah sat on the sofa, feeding Noah with a bottle Martha had found in a storage closet. She was quiet, her eyes darting to the windows as if expecting danger to appear at any moment. James noticed, his jaw tightening. "Who are you running from?" he asked, sitting across from her. Sarah hesitated, her fingers tightening around the bottle. "His name's Tom," she said finally, her voice low. "My ex. He wasn't good to me. When I got pregnant, he got worse. Said he didn't want a kid, that I'd ruined everything. I was scared he'd..." She trailed off, her eyes dropping to Noah. James's hands clenched into fists, a familiar anger rising. He'd seen men like that before, men who thought power meant control, who broke those they claimed to love. "He know where you are?" he asked. "I don't think so," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I hitchhiked, took back roads. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, but he's persistent." James nodded, his mind already working. The ranch was isolated, but not invisible. If this Tom was as bad as Sarah said, he'd come looking, eventually. "You're safe here for now," he said, "but we need to figure out a plan." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why are you helping me? You don't even know me." James didn't answer right away. He thought of Emily, of her belief that people came into your life for a reason. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally, the words feeling inadequate, but true. The day passed quietly, the ranch settling into its familiar rhythm. Martha cooked a hearty lunch of stew and cornbread, insisting Sarah eat to regain her strength. James spent the afternoon in the fields, checking fences and tending to the cattle, but his thoughts kept drifting to the barn, to the baby, to Sarah's haunted eyes. Daisy followed him when he returned to the house, her puppies now tucked safely in a box he'd brought inside, placed near her bed in the living room. That night, as the stars glittered above the plains, James sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, Daisy at his feet. The house was quiet, Sarah and Noah asleep in the guest room, Martha gone home for the evening. He looked out at the dark fields, feeling the weight of the day settle over him. Something had changed, something he couldn't name. For the first time in 3 years, the ranch didn't feel so empty, but the peace was fleeting. The next morning, as James was repairing a gate near the property line, he spotted a car parked under a lone cottonwood tree about a quarter-mile from the house. Through his binoculars, he saw a man inside, his face obscured but his posture tense, watching the ranch. James's gut twisted. He didn't know who the man was, but he had a sinking feeling it was Tom. The Montana sun hung low over the plains, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the golden fields of Carter's ranch. James Carter stood by the fence line, his binoculars pressed to his eyes, the weight of unease settling in his chest like a stone. The car under the cottonwood tree hadn't moved. Its sleek black frame glinted in the fading light. And the man inside sat motionless, his silhouette sharp against the tinted windows. James didn't need to see his face to know who it was. Sarah's words echoed in his mind. He's persistent. Tom, the man who'd driven her to flee, was here, watching, waiting. James lowered the binoculars, his jaw tightening as he mounted, shadow and urged the horse toward the house, dust rising in their wake. Inside, the ranch house was quiet, save for the soft clatter of dishes as Martha washed up after lunch. Sarah sat on the living room sofa, Noah cradled in her arms, his tiny fingers curling around her thumb. She looked up as James burst through the door, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor. "Martha, Sarah," he said, his voice low but urgent. "Close the curtains, now." Martha paused, a plate dripping in her hands. "What's wrong, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her eyes narrowing. "There's a car out there," James said, crossing to the living room window and pulling the heavy drapes shut. "About a quarter-mile off under the cottonwood. Someone's watching the house." Sarah's face paled, her grip on Noah tightening. "It's him, isn't it?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's Tom." James met her gaze, his expression hard but steady. "I don't know for sure, but I'm not taking chances. Stay away from the windows." Martha locked the back door. Martha set the plate down and moved quickly, her usual calm replaced by a quiet urgency. Sarah stood, clutching Noah to her chest, her eyes darting to the closed curtains as if expecting Tom to appear through them. "He found me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew he would. He always does." James stepped closer, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "He's not getting in here, Sarah. Not while I'm around. You and Noah are safe." Her eyes searched his, wide with fear but flickering with something else. Trust, maybe, or desperation for it. She nodded slowly, swallowing hard, but the tension in her body didn't ease. James turned to Martha, who'd returned from locking the door. "Keep an eye on them," he said. "I'm going to check it out." "Be careful, Mr. Carter," Martha said, her voice firm but laced with concern. "Don't do anything foolish." James grabbed his shotgun from the corner of the room, the familiar weight grounding him. "I won't," he said, though the anger simmering in his chest made him less certain. He stepped outside, the cool evening air hitting his face as he scanned the horizon. The car was still there, a dark speck against the fading light. He considered riding out to confront the man but thought better of it. If it was Tom, he'd want to draw him closer on James's terms, where he could control the situation. Back inside, the house felt like a fortress under siege. Sarah sat on the sofa, rocking Noah gently, her eyes fixed on the floor. Martha busied herself in the kitchen, but her glances toward Sarah were heavy with worry. James stood by the window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtains. The car hadn't moved, but the man inside shifted occasionally, a shadow adjusting his position. "He's just sitting there," James muttered, more to himself than to the others. "What does he want?" Sarah asked, her voice small. "He doesn't even want Noah. He can't stand losing control." James turned, his eyes softening as he looked at her. "Men like that don't need a reason. They hurt because they can. But he's not touching you or the boy. I promise you that." Sarah nodded, but her hands trembled as she adjusted Noah's blanket. Martha emerged from the kitchen, a tray of tea in her hands. "Here, drink this," she said, setting a cup in front of Sarah. "It'll calm your nerves." To James, she added, "You need to eat something too, Mr. Carter. Can't protect anyone on an empty stomach." "I'm fine," James said, but he took the sandwich she offered, more to appease her than out of hunger. The hours dragged on, the car remaining a silent threat in the distance. As night fell, its headlights flicked on briefly before it pulled away, disappearing down the dirt road. James exhaled, but the relief was fleeting. He knew this wasn't over. The next morning, the ranch woke to a tense calm. James rose early, checking on Daisy in her corner of the living room. The golden retriever was resting comfortably, her 4 puppies nestled against her, their tiny bodies warm and squirming. He stroked her head, her tail thumping weakly in response. "Good girl," he murmured, his thoughts drifting to the surreal moment he'd found Noah among her litter. It still didn't make sense, but Daisy's acceptance of the human child had stirred something in him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since Emily. Sarah was in the kitchen when he entered, feeding Noah with a bottle. She looked better, her face less pale, but her eyes still carried the weight of fear. "Did he come back?" she asked, not looking up. "Not yet," James said, pouring himself coffee. "But I'm keeping watch. You focus on Noah and getting your strength back." Martha arrived soon after, her usual brisk efficiency tempered by a quiet concern. She set about preparing breakfast, her eyes flicking to Sarah and Noah. "That dog's a miracle," she said, nodding toward Daisy. "Taking care of a human baby like one of her own. Never seen anything like it," James grunted, his mind elsewhere. He couldn't shake the image of the car, the man inside watching like a predator circling its prey. After breakfast, he headed out to the fields, needing the distraction of work. He repaired a broken fence post, the physical labor grounding him, but his eyes kept drifting to the road. No sign of the car, but the unease lingered. It was mid-morning when the scream shattered the quiet. "James! James!" Martha's voice, sharp with panic, came from the porch. James dropped his hammer and ran, his heart pounding as he crossed the yard. Martha stood at the porch door, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. "It's Daisy!" she gasped. "Come quick!" James pushed past her, his boots skidding on the wooden floor as he reached the porch. Daisy lay sprawled across the boards, her body convulsing, foam dripping from her mouth. Her eyes were rolled back, her breath shallow and ragged. The puppies whimpered in their box nearby, sensing their mother's distress. James's blood ran cold. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he touched her fur. "Daisy, girl, hold on," he whispered, his voice breaking. Then he saw it, a piece of paper tied to her collar stained with dirt and spittle. He untied it with shaking fingers, the words scrawled in a jagged hand. "You chose to protect them. Now you know the cost." Rage surged through him, hot and blinding, but he pushed it down. Daisy was all that mattered now. He scooped her up, her limp body heavy in his arms, and ran to his truck, ignoring Martha's cries and Sarah's wide-eyed stare from the living room window. "Call Dr. Ellis," he shouted to Martha, as he laid Daisy on the passenger seat, wrapping her in a blanket to keep her secure. The engine roared to life, and he sped down the dirt road, dust billowing behind him. The veterinarian's clinic was 20 miles away in Willow Creek, and every second felt like an eternity. Daisy's breathing was shallow, her body twitching with each spasm. "Stay with me, girl," James murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "You're tougher than this." The clinic was a small whitewashed building on the edge of town. James screeched to a stop, carrying Daisy inside as Dr. Ellis, a wiry man with gray hair and steady hands, rushed out to meet him. "She's been poisoned," James said, his voice tight as he handed her over. "Do something, please." Dr. Ellis didn't waste words. He carried Daisy into the treatment room, barking orders to his assistant. James followed, helpless, as they hooked Daisy up to an IV, administering an antidote and flushing her system. "It's likely antifreeze or rat poison," Ellis said, his tone grim. "Common for someone trying to hurt an animal. She's strong, James, but it was close." James sat in the waiting room, his hands clasped tightly, his mind a storm of guilt and fury. Daisy had been his constant, the one who'd stayed by his side when the world fell apart. The thought of losing her was unbearable, but the note burned, in his pocket, a reminder of the man responsible. Tom. It had to be him. James's fists clenched, his knuckles white. He'd deal with Tom later, but first Daisy had to pull through. Back at the ranch, Sarah was spiraling. She sat on the couch, Noah clutched tightly to her chest, her eyes red from crying. Martha paced the living room, muttering prayers under her breath. "She doesn't deserve this," Martha said, her voice trembling. "That sweet dog, taking care of your boy like he was her own." "It's my fault," Sarah said suddenly, standing with a jerky motion. "I have to leave. If I stay, he'll hurt someone else. He'll hurt James or you or Noah. I can't let that happen." Martha stepped in front of her, her hands firm on Sarah's shoulders. "You're not going anywhere, girl. You think running will stop him? He'll find you, and then what? You've got no one out there. Here, you've got us. James is risking everything to keep you safe. Don't throw that away." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, her resolve crumbling. "What if he comes back? What if he hurts Daisy again or worse?" "Trust James," Martha said, her voice steady. "He's not the man folks in town think he is. He's got a heart, bigger than this ranch, and he'll do whatever it takes to protect you and that baby. Now sit down and wait. We'll pray for Daisy." Sarah sank back onto the couch, her tears falling silently as she rocked Noah. Martha sat beside her, offering a handkerchief and a quiet presence. The hours crawled by, the house heavy with worry. Sarah's mind replayed every moment with Tom. His fists, his threats, the way he'd promised to fix her when she told him she was pregnant. She'd run to protect Noah, but now she'd brought danger to this quiet ranch, to people who'd shown her nothing but kindness. At the clinic, Dr. Ellis finally emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. "She's going to make it," he said, a faint smile breaking through his fatigue. "It was touch and go, but she's strong. She'll need rest, fluids, and close monitoring, but she's out of the woods." James stood, relief washing over him like a wave. "Thank you, Doc," he said, shaking Ellis's hand with a grip that conveyed more than words could. He entered the treatment room, where Daisy lay on a padded table, her eyes half open but alert. Her tail gave a weak wag, and James knelt beside her, stroking her fur. "You scared me, girl," he whispered, his voice thick. "Don't do that again." He drove home as the sun dipped below the horizon, Daisy wrapped in blankets beside him. The ranch came into view, its lights glowing, warmly against the twilight. Martha and Sarah were waiting on the porch, their faces tense with anticipation. When James stepped out carrying Daisy, Martha's hands flew to her face. "Is she?" she asked, her voice trembling. "She's gonna be fine," James said, his voice steady but tired. "Doc got the poison out. She just needs rest." Sarah let out a shaky breath, tears spilling over as she clutched Noah. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "This is because of me. If I hadn't come here—" "Stop," James said, his tone firm but not harsh. He laid Daisy gently in her bed, the puppies immediately nuzzling against her. "This isn't your fault. It's his. And he's not gonna win." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing this, James? You don't owe me anything." He didn't answer right away, his gaze drifting to Daisy, then to Noah in Sarah's arms. "Because you and that boy deserve better," he said finally. "And because I know what it's like to lose everything. I'm not letting that happen to you." Martha watched from the doorway, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. She'd seen James at his lowest, a man who'd shut out the world. But now he was fighting for something, someone, again. It was a change she hadn't dared hope for. The next few days were tense but quiet. Daisy recovered slowly, her strength returning with each passing hour. James moved her bed closer to the fireplace, checking on her constantly, while Martha kept the house running, her maternal instincts extending to Sarah and Noah. Sarah began to relax, her smiles coming more easily. As she watched Noah grow stronger, his tiny giggles filling the house, James found himself lingering in the living room, watching them, a warmth spreading in his chest that he hadn't felt since Emily. But the shadow of Tom loomed. James kept a vigilant watch, his binoculars always close at hand. The car didn't return, but he knew better than to think Tom had given up. Men like that didn't walk away. One afternoon, as James was repairing a fence near the orchard, he spotted dust rising on the horizon. His heart sank as he recognized the black car, pulling up to the ranch gate this time. Tom was making his move. James rode Shadow back to the house, his pulse pounding. He found Sarah in the kitchen feeding Noah and Martha chopping vegetables for dinner. "He's here," James said, his voice low. "At the gate." Sarah froze, her face draining of color. "No," she whispered, clutching Noah so tightly he whimpered. "He can't." "Stay inside," James said, grabbing his shotgun. "Martha, lock everything. Don't open the door unless it's me." Martha nodded, her face set with determination. "Be careful, Mr. Carter." James stepped outside, the shotgun resting on his shoulder, his strides long and purposeful. The car was parked just beyond the gate, and a man stepped out. Tall, lean, with a polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. He wore a clean shirt and jeans, his hair neatly combed, but there was something predatory in his stance. "Afternoon," he called, his voice smooth. "Name's Tom. I'm looking for my girlfriend, Sarah. Red hair. Pregnant. Folks in town said she might have come this way." James stopped a few feet away, his grip on the shotgun steady. "I don't know any Sarah," he said, his voice cold. "And I don't take kindly to strangers showing up on my land." Tom's smile tightened, his eyes scanning the house behind James. "Just want to make sure she's okay. She's carrying my kid, you know. Family business." "If she's your family, why'd she run?" James asked, stepping closer. "Doesn't sound like she felt safe with you." Tom's facade slipped for a moment, a flash of anger crossing his face before he masked it. "She's confused," he said, his tone colder. "Need someone to look out for her. I'm just trying to do right by her." James took another step, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm gonna say this once. Get in your car and leave. You come back, you'll regret it." Tom held his gaze, weighing his options. Finally, he raised his hands in mock surrender. "All right, friend. No need for trouble, I'll go." He climbed back into the car, his eyes never leaving James, and drove off, the engine's growl fading into the distance. James didn't move until the car was out of sight. When he returned to the house, Sarah was trembling, Noah in her arms. "He's gone," James said, setting the shotgun down. "But he'll be back. We need to be ready." Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry, James. I never meant to bring this to you." He knelt beside her, his voice softer. "You didn't bring this, he did. And I'm not letting him hurt you or Noah. You hear me?" She looked at him, her eyes brimming with gratitude and fear. "I hear you," she whispered. That night the ranch was quiet, but the tension lingered like a storm waiting to break. James sat on the porch, Daisy at his side, her breathing steady. "Ow." He looked out at the stars, Emily's voice echoing in his mind. Kindness is never wasted. He wasn't sure what lay ahead, but for the first time in years, he felt alive, tethered to something worth fighting for. The Montana night draped Carter's ranch in a velvet hush, broken only by the soft chirping of crickets and the occasional low of cattle in the distance. Inside the house, the air was thick with unspoken fears. James Carter sat in the living room, his shotgun propped against the wall within arm's reach, his eyes fixed on the drawn curtains. Daisy lay in her bed, by the fireplace, her puppies nestled against her, their tiny whimpers a reminder of her recent brush with death. Sarah sat on the sofa, Noah cradled in her arms, her face pale and drawn. Martha moved quietly in the kitchen, her usual efficiency tempered by a vigilance that matched James's own. The memory of Tom's car lingered like a storm cloud, and, though he hadn't returned since the confrontation at the gate, James knew it was only a matter of time. Sarah's voice broke the silence, barely above a whisper. "He's not going to stop, is he?" James looked at her, his jaw tight. "Men like him don't stop unless they're made to," he said, his voice low but steady. "But he's not getting to you or Noah. Not here." Sarah nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She adjusted Noah's blanket, her fingers trembling. "I keep thinking about Daisy," she said, glancing at the dog. "If I hadn't come here, she wouldn't have been hurt. You wouldn't be in danger." James leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You didn't do this, Sarah." "He did. And Daisy's tougher than she looks. She's already bouncing back." He managed a small smile, hoping to ease her guilt, but the weight in her eyes didn't lift. Martha emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "You need to eat, both of you," she said, setting a tray of sandwiches on the coffee table. "Worrying on an empty stomach won't help anyone." James took a sandwich, more to appease her than out of hunger. Sarah shook her head, her gaze distant. "I'm not hungry," she murmured, rocking Noah gently. The baby cooed, oblivious to the tension around him, his tiny hand grasping at the air. Martha sat beside Sarah, her voice soft but firm. "You've got to keep your strength up, girl. For that boy, he needs you strong." Sarah nodded slowly, taking a small bite of a sandwich at Martha's insistence. James watched them, a flicker of warmth breaking through his guarded exterior. He'd spent 3 years shutting out the world, convinced that solitude was his only path after Emily's death. But now, with Sarah and Noah in his home, the ranch felt different, alive in a way it hadn't been since Emily's laughter filled its rooms. It scared him, that feeling, but it also anchored him, giving him something to hold on to. The next morning dawned clear, the Montana sky a vast expanse of blue stretching over the plains. James rose early, checking on Daisy before heading out to the fields. The dog was stronger, her tail wagging more firmly as she licked her puppies. "You're a fighter, girl," James said, scratching her ears. He glanced toward the guest room, where Sarah and Noah were still asleep, and felt a quiet resolve settle over him. He'd protect them, no matter what it took. He rode shadow along the fence line, his binoculars scanning the horizon. The cottonwood tree where Tom's car had parked was empty, but James didn't trust the calm. He tightened a loose wire on a post, his hands moving with practiced precision, but his mind was elsewhere. Memories of Emily surfaced unbidden. Her smile as they danced on the porch, her voice planning their future. The way she'd held his hand during her final days, whispering, "Don't let the world break you, James." He'd failed her then, shutting himself off, but Sarah and Noah were a second chance, a reason to keep that promise. Back at the house, Sarah was helping Martha in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for a stew. Noah lay in a makeshift crib nearby, a wooden box lined with blankets, his soft gurgles filling the room. Sarah's movements were hesitant, her eyes darting to the windows despite the closed curtains. Martha noticed, her voice gentle. "You're safe here, Sarah. James won't let anything happen to you." Sarah paused, her knife hovering over a carrot. "He's doing so much for us," she said quietly. "I don't understand why. He doesn't even know me." Martha smiled, a knowing glint in her eyes. "James has a good heart, even if he hides it under all that gruff. He's been through his own pain, lost someone he loved. Maybe helping you is his way of finding himself again." Sarah looked down, her throat tight. "I just don't want anyone else to get hurt because of me." Before Martha could respond, a sharp knock at the door startled them both. Sarah froze, her eyes wide with panic. Martha set down her spoon and moved to the door, peering through the peephole. "It's just Mr. Thompson," she said, relief in her voice. "The feed supplier." James returned as Martha was signing for the delivery, his eyes scanning the yard for any sign of trouble. "Everything all right?" he asked, stepping inside. "Just the usual delivery," Martha said, but her glance toward Sarah was heavy with meaning. James nodded, his gaze settling on Sarah, who was clutching Noah tightly. "He hasn't come back," James said, answering her unspoken question. "But I'm keeping watch. You don't need to worry." Sarah nodded, but her fear was palpable. James wanted to say more, to promise her safety in a way that would erase the terror in her eyes, but words felt inadequate. Instead, he busied himself unloading the feed sacks. the physical labor a welcome distraction. The day passed without incident, but the tension remained. James took to patrolling the ranch at dusk, his shotgun slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the horizon. Daisy followed him when she could, her strength returning, her puppies now scampering playfully around her bed. Sarah stayed close to the house, rarely venturing outside, her world narrowed to Noah and the safety of the walls around her. Martha kept the household running, her quiet presence a steadying force, but even she couldn't ignore the storm brewing. It was 3 days later when the storm broke. James was in the barn, checking on a repaired stall, when he heard the roar of an engine. He stepped outside, his heart sinking as he saw the black car speeding down the dirt road toward the ranch gate. This time, Tom wasn't lurking from a distance. He was coming straight for the house. James ran, his boots pounding the earth, reaching the house just as the car screeched to a stop. Sarah was in the living room feeding Noah and Martha was at the stove. "He's here," James said, his voice sharp. "Sarah, take Noah to the bedroom, lock the door and stay there." Sarah's face drained of color, but she nodded, clutching Noah and hurrying down the hall. Martha grabbed a kitchen knife, her eyes fierce. "You be careful, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low. James picked up his shotgun and stepped outside, the weapon resting on his shoulder. Tom was already out of the car, standing by the gate, his posture relaxed but his eyes cold. He was dressed impeccably, his shirt pressed, his boots polished, but James saw the predator beneath the facade. "Back again?" James called, stopping a few yards away. "I told you to stay off my land." Tom's smile was thin, his hands raised in mock surrender. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice smooth as oil. "I just want Sarah. She's my girl carrying my kid. You can't keep her from me." James stepped closer, his grip on the shotgun tightening. "She's not your anything. She ran from you for a reason. Now get in your car and leave or we're gonna have a problem." Tom's smile faded, his eyes narrowing. "You don't know who you're dealing with, friend. Sarah's confused, doesn't know what's good for her. I'm here to take her home." James took another step, his voice low and dangerous. "You're not taking anyone. Last chance, Tom. Leave." Tom's composure cracked, a flash of anger crossing his face. He stepped forward, his hands balling into fists. "You think you can play hero? She's mine, and so's that kid. You're gonna regret getting in my way." James raised the shotgun, not aiming but making his point clear. "Try me," he said, his voice steady as stone. "This is my land, my home. Anyone I protect is my responsibility. You come for them, you deal with me." For a moment the air was electric, the two men locked in a silent standoff. Tom's eyes darted to the house, then back to James, calculating. Finally he stepped back, his smile returning but laced with venom. "This isn't over," he said, climbing into his car. "You can't hide her forever." James watched as the car sped off, dust swirling in its wake. He didn't move until it was out of sight, his heart pounding with a mix of rage and relief. When he returned to the house, Sarah was still in the bedroom, the door locked. He knocked softly. "Sarah, it's me." "He's gone." The door opened slowly. Sarah's face pale, her eyes red from crying. Noah was in her arms, fussing softly. "What did he say?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He wanted you," James said, his tone gentle but firm. "I told him he's not getting anywhere near you or Noah. He left, but we need to be ready. He's not done." Sarah's tears spilled over, and she sank onto the bed, clutching Noah. "I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't keep running, but I can't stay if it means putting you in danger. Daisy almost died because of me." James knelt beside her, his hand resting lightly on her arm. "Listen to me, Sarah. You're not putting anyone in danger. Tom's the one making these choices, not you. And I'm not letting him win. You and Noah, you're safe here. I'll make sure of it." Sarah looked at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing this, James? You could have turned me away, called the sheriff, anything. Why risk everything for us?" James hesitated, his throat tight. He thought of Emily, of the promises he'd made and broken, of the years he'd spent hiding from life. "Because you and Noah deserve a chance," he said finally. "And because I know what it's like to lose everything that matters. I'm not letting that happen to you." Sarah's eyes softened, a flicker of hope breaking through her fear. She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "Thanks, you," she whispered, the words heavy with meaning. Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "You handled that well, Mr. Carter," she said. "But that man's trouble. He's not going to stop." "I know," James said, standing. "We'll deal with it, together." The next few days were a delicate balance of vigilance and routine. James doubled his patrols, checking the ranch's perimeter at dawn and dusk, his shotgun always close. Daisy grew stronger, her puppies now toddling around the living room, their playful yips a welcome distraction. Sarah began to open up, sharing small stories about her life before Tom, a childhood in a small town, dreams of becoming a teacher, the way she'd always loved animals. James listened, his usual silence giving way to quiet questions, his interest genuine. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch, Noah in Sarah's arms, and Daisy's puppies scampering around their feet, James found himself smiling. Noah giggled as a puppy nipped at his blanket, and Sarah laughed, a sound that warmed the air. "He likes them," she said, her eyes bright. "They're a handful," James said, watching as one puppy tumbled over another. "Like their mama. Daisy's always been a troublemaker, but she's got a heart bigger than this ranch." Urasa looked at him, her smile softening. "She saved Noah. I'll never forget that." James nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "She's special. Always has been." He paused, then added, "You're doing all right, Sarah. You and Noah. You're stronger than you think." Her cheeks flushed, and she looked down at Noah, her fingers brushing his tiny cheek. "I don't feel strong, but having you and Martha here, it makes me believe I can be." The moment lingered, a quiet connection forming between them. James felt it, the pull of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since Emily. It scared him, but it also felt right, like a door opening after years of being locked shut. That evening, as Martha prepared dinner, she caught James watching Sarah and Noah with a softness she hadn't seen in years. "You're getting attached, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone teasing but warm. James grunted, pouring himself coffee to avoid her gaze. "Just doing what's right." Martha chuckled, shaking her head. "Sure you are, but I've seen that look before. You're not fooling anyone." He didn't respond, but her words stayed with him, stirring thoughts he wasn't ready to face. He focused on the practical, keeping the ranch secure, watching for Tom's return. But deep down, he knew Martha was right. Sarah and Noah were becoming more than just people he was protecting. They were becoming his reason to keep going. The next morning, the peace shattered. James was in the orchard, checking the irrigation lines, when he heard the familiar roar of an engine. He grabbed his binoculars, his heart racing as he spotted Tom's car pulling up to the gate. This time, Tom didn't wait. He stepped out, his posture aggressive, and started toward the house, a crowbar in his hand. James dropped the binoculars and ran, his boots pounding the earth. He reached the house just as Tom reached the porch, his crowbar raised as if to pry open the door. "Stop right there!" James shouted, his shotgun aimed at Tom's chest. Tom froze, his eyes narrowing. "You again," he spat. "Give me Sarah and the kid and we won't have a problem." James stepped closer, his voice low and deadly. "You're not taking anyone. You're done here, Tom. Get off my land or I'll make sure you don't." "Walk away," Tom laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think you're tough, huh? She's mine, and I'm not leaving without her." James's finger tightened on the trigger, his patience gone. "Last chance," he said. "Leave, or you'll regret it." Tom hesitated, his eyes flicking to the shotgun, then to the house. For a moment, it seemed he might push further, but something in James's expression, the unyielding resolve, the promise of consequences, made him back down. "This isn't over," he snarled, retreating to his car. He sped off, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. James lowered the shotgun, his chest heaving. He returned to the house, finding Sarah and Martha in the living room, their faces pale. "He's gone," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. "But we need to end this. He's not going to stop." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "What do we do?" she asked. James looked at her, then at Noah, sleeping peacefully in her arms. "We call the sheriff," he said. "Get a restraining order, document everything, and if he comes back, I'll deal with him." Martha nodded approvingly. "Smart move, Mr. Carter. Let the law handle it, but keep that shotgun close." The rest of the day was spent preparing. James called Sheriff Julio, a man he'd known since high school, and explained the situation without revealing Sarah's presence. Julio promised to patrol the area and file the necessary paperwork. Sarah shared details of Tom's abuse, dates, incidents, threats, her voice trembling, but resolute. James listened, his anger growing with every word, but he kept it in check, focusing on the plan. That night, as the ranch settled into a fragile calm, James sat on the porch, Daisy at his side. Sarah joined him, Noah asleep in her arms. The stars were bright, the air cool and crisp. "Thank you," she said softly. "For everything." James looked at her, his heart heavy with a feeling he couldn't name. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "Just stay. You and Noah, you belong here." Sarah's eyes met his, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. "I want to," she said, her voice barely audible. "I really do." James nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Then we'll figure it out," he said. "Together." The Montana dawn broke gently over Carter's ranch, painting the plains with a soft pink glow. The air was cool, carrying the scent of dew and wildflowers, a quiet promise of renewal. James Carter stood on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, his eyes scanning the horizon. The past week had been a storm of tension, with Tom's menacing presence lingering like a shadow over the ranch. But this morning the road was empty, the cottonwood tree standing alone under the rising sun. James exhaled, his breath visible in the crisp air, but the calm felt fragile, like glass waiting to shatter. Inside, the house was warm and alive with small sounds. Daisy's puppies yipping softly in their box by the fireplace, Martha humming. As she prepared breakfast, Sarah's gentle voice cooing to Noah in the living room. James glanced through the window, catching sight of Sarah on the sofa. Noah nestled against her chest. Her auburn hair caught the morning light, and her smile, though still tinged with worry, held a spark of hope that hadn't been there a week ago. James's chest tightened, a mix of protectiveness and something deeper, something he hadn't dared name since Emily. The confrontation with Tom had left them all on edge. James had called Sheriff Julio, who'd promised to keep an eye on the ranch and file a restraining order based on Sarah's account of Tom's abuse. The paperwork was in motion, but James knew men like Tom didn't care about legalities. He'd kept his shotgun close, patrolling the ranch at dawn and dusk, his senses attuned to every sound. Daisy, now fully recovered from the poisoning, followed him faithfully, her tail wagging with renewed vigor. Her puppies, growing stronger each day, tumbled around the living room, their antics drawing rare laughter from Sarah. James stepped inside, setting his mug on the counter as Martha slid a plate of bacon and eggs toward him. "You look like you haven't slept in a week, Mr. Carter," she said, her tone teasing but her eyes sharp with concern. "I'm fine," James said, taking a seat. "Just keeping watch." Martha nodded, glancing toward Sarah, who was feeding Noah a bottle. "She's stronger than she looks, that one, but she's still scared. You're doing right by her." James grunted, focusing on his breakfast to avoid her knowing gaze. Martha had a way of seeing through him, and he wasn't ready to admit the truth, that Sarah and Noah had become more than just people he was protecting. They'd filled a void he'd thought would stay empty forever. Sarah looked up, catching his eye. "Any sign of him?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with fear. Not today, James said, his tone steady. Sheriff's got eyes on the roads. We'll know if he comes back. She nodded, but her fingers tightened around the bottle, her knuckles white. Noah gurgled, oblivious to the tension, his tiny hand grasping at the air. James watched them, a quiet resolve settling over him. He'd promised to keep them safe, and he meant it, no matter what it took. The morning passed in a delicate rhythm. James worked in the fields, mending a fence and checking the cattle, while Sarah helped Martha in the kitchen, her movements more confident with each passing day. Daisy's puppies scampered around the porch, their playful barks blending with the distant call of a meadowlark. But the peace was shattered just after noon, when the sound of an engine cut through the air. James was in the orchard, repairing an irrigation line, when he heard it. He grabbed his binoculars, his heart racing as he spotted a police cruiser, pulling up to the ranch gate. Not Tom's black car, but the sight still set him on edge. He mounted Shadow and rode back to the house, his pulse pounding. Sarah and Martha were in the living room, their faces tense as they heard the approaching vehicle. "It's the sheriff," James said, peering through the curtains. "Sarah, take Noah to the bedroom. Lock the door until I say it's safe." Sarah's eyes widened, but she nodded, clutching Noah and hurrying down the hall. Martha stayed in the kitchen, her hands clasped tightly, her expression unreadable. James adjusted his hat and stepped outside, his shotgun left inside, but his stance firm. Sheriff Julio, a stocky man with a weathered face and a calm demeanor, stood by the cruiser, his hat in his hands. "Morning, James," Julio said, his tone serious. "Hope I'm not interrupting." "No trouble," James said, nodding. "What brings you out here?" Julio sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "We're looking for a woman named Sarah. Red hair, pregnant, or maybe just had a baby. Her boyfriend Tom reported her missing, said she might have come this way." James's heart thudded, but he kept his expression neutral. "Why are you looking for her?" he asked, his voice steady. Julio's eyes softened, a hint of sympathy breaking through his professional facade. "There was an accident last night. Tom's car was found overturned on a dirt road about 10 miles from here. He was drunk, lost control. He didn't make it." James stood still, processing the words. Relief flooded him, sharp and overwhelming, but he tempered it with a feigned look of concern. "That's rough," he said, shaking his head. "I haven't seen any woman around here, but if I do, I'll let you know." Julio nodded, his gaze lingering on James as if sensing there was more to the story. "Appreciate that. Just trying to tie up loose ends. If she's out there, she needs to know. She's safe now." James watched as Julio climbed back into the cruiser and drove off, the dust settling slowly behind him. He waited until the car was out of sight before returning to the house, his steps lighter despite the weight of the news. He knocked on the bedroom door. "Sarah, it's me. You can come out." The door opened slowly, Sarah's face pale, her eyes wide with anxiety. Noah fussed in her arms, sensing her tension. "What happened?" she asked, her voice trembling. James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "It was the sheriff. They were looking for you, but not to take you back. Tom's dead, Sarah. His car crashed last night. He was drunk. It's over." Sarah's eyes widened, shock giving way to a slow, shaky exhale. She sank onto the bed, clutching Noah tightly, tears streaming down her face. He's gone?" she whispered, as if afraid to believe it. James nodded, kneeling beside her. "Yeah, you don't have to run anymore. You and Noah are free." Sarah's tears fell faster, a mix of relief and something heavier. Moderation. Grief. Guilt. Relief. "I didn't want him to die," she said, her voice breaking. "I just wanted to be free. But maybe this is justice in a way." James placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle but firm. "It's not your fault, Sarah. What happened was his doing, not yours. You're safe now. That's what matters." Martha, listening from the doorway, closed her eyes briefly, a silent prayer of thanks on her lips. She stepped forward, her voice warm. "You hear that, girl? You're free. You and that little one can start over now." Sarah nodded, her tears slowing as she looked down at Noah, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms. "Thank you, James," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." James shook his head, uncomfortable with the gratitude. "Don't thank me yet. We've got a lot to figure out, but you're staying here until you're ready to decide what's next." The days that followed were quieter, the shadow of Tom's threat lifted like a storm cloud passing. Sarah's smiles came more easily, her laughter mingling with Noah's giggles as they played with Daisy's puppies. On the porch, James found himself drawn to them, lingering in the house more than usual, his gruff exterior softening with each passing day. He'd catch himself watching Sarah as she sang to Noah, her voice soft and clear, or laughing as a puppy nipped at her fingers. It stirred memories of Emily, her warmth, her light. But it wasn't just memory. Sarah and Noah were their own kind of light, filling the ranch with life in a way James hadn't thought possible. One afternoon, as they sat in the orchard under the shade of an apple tree, Noah babbling happily in Sarah's lap, James felt a shift inside him. The grief that had defined him for so long was still there, but it was softer now, overshadowed by something new. Hope. He looked at Sarah, her auburn hair glowing in the sunlight, and cleared his throat. "Sarah, I've been thinking," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "about you and Noah, about what happens next." Sarah looked up, her eyes curious but cautious. "What do you mean?" James took a deep breath, his hands fidgeting with a blade of grass. "I don't want you to leave," he said, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "This place, it's been empty for a long time. But with you here, with Noah, it feels like a home again. I want you to stay, not just because you need a place, but because I love you, Sarah. I love Noah like he's my own. I want us to be a family." Sarah's eyes widened, tears welling as she stared at him. "James," she began, her voice trembling, "you've done so much for us already. I don't know what to say." "Say you'll stay," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. "Say you'll let me be part of your life. I know it's fast and I know you've been through hell, but I mean it, Sarah. I want you both here, with me." A tear rolled down her cheek, but it wasn't sadness. It was something brighter, something alive. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I never thought I'd find someone like you, James. Someone who makes me feel safe, who makes Noah feel safe. Yes, I'll stay. I want to build a life here with you." James's heart swelled, a smile breaking across his face. He reached for her hand, his rough fingers entwining with hers. And in that moment, the world felt right. He leaned closer, their faces inches apart, and their lips met in a gentle, tentative kiss. A promise of a future neither had dared to dream of. Martha, watching from the porch with a basket of laundry, smiled to herself, shaking her head. "About time," she muttered, turning back to the house to give them their moment. Months later, the ranch was transformed. Sarah and Noah had settled in, their presence a constant warmth in James's life. He made a decision that had been growing. In his heart, he wanted Noah to be his son, legally and forever. He sat Sarah down one evening, the fire crackling in the living room, Daisy's puppies now half-grown and sprawled across the floor. "I want to adopt Noah," he said, his voice steady. "I want him to have my name, to be mine in every way. That matters." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, her hand reaching for his. "You don't have to do this, James. You're already his father in every way that counts." "I have to," James said, his voice firm. "Because he's my son, Sarah. He has been since the moment I held him in that barn." The adoption process was swift, with Sarah's full support. Noah Carter became official, his name a symbol of the family they were building. James felt a pride he hadn't known was possible, a sense of completeness that healed the wounds Emily's loss had left. One quiet afternoon, as they walked through the orchard, the air sweet with the scent of blooming apples, James stopped and took Sarah's hand. He knelt, pulling a small box from his pocket, his heart pounding. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You and Noah changed my life. You gave me a reason to believe again. I don't want to spend a single day without you. Will you marry me?" Sarah's hands flew to her face, laughter and tears mingling. "Yes, James," she said, her voice trembling. 1,000 times yes. The wedding was held on the ranch, a simple affair under the wide Montana sky. The porch was adorned with wildflowers Martha and James had gathered, the tables covered with white linens she'd sewn herself. The guests were few, close friends, from Willow Creek, the sheriff, and a handful of neighbors who'd watched James's transformation with quiet awe. Daisy, fully recovered, stole the show, carrying the rings on a small cushion tied to her collar, her tail wagging as she trotted to the makeshift altar. Her puppies, now sturdy and playful, darted around the tables drawing laughter from the guests. Martha, wearing a floral dress, served as both wedding sponsor and Noah's godmother, her eyes glistening with pride. As James and Sarah exchanged rings, she whispered to a friend, "I knew they'd find their way." When the ceremony ended, James took Sarah's hand and faced the guests, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Thank you for being here," he said. "This ranch has always been my home, but today, it's more than that. It's a family, because of Sarah, Noah, Martha, Daisy, and all of you who believed in us." The day ended with music and dancing. Under the stars, the laughter of friends and the warmth of love filling the air. Sarah held Noah, now a chubby, bright-eyed boy, as he giggled at the puppy's antics. James watched them, his heart full. The ranch no longer a place of solitude but a home brimming with life. As the night gave way to a clear morning, the ranch woke to the soft clinking of silverware and the smell of Martha's hearty breakfast. James, Sarah, Noah, and Martha sat around the table, a family bound by love and resilience. The story of the baby in the barn had become a legend in Willow Creek, a tale of miracles and second chances. For James, it was more than a story. It was the moment his life began again. And so Carter's Ranch became a place of new beginnings, where a man who'd lost everything found a family, where a dog's love bridged the impossible, and where hope grew stronger than fear. The plains stretched endlessly before them, a canvas for a future they'd build together.